Hello everyone, this is MonteCristo, and today I want to talk about something that has been brought up in numerous interviews by Jeff Kaplan from the Overwatch League development team recently, including one that I'll link below where he talks to Stylosa. But it's about the potential in Overwatch of locking roles in both casual and presumably professional play at 2 supports, 2 tanks, and 2 DPS, and as well as role queue and what this could mean for the Overwatch League and the esports scene. I am highly in favor of a role lock system for reasons I'll explain, but first let's talk about a little bit of a history lesson when it comes to my previous game, League of Legends, and what role locks did very successfully in LOL. I think that role locking was one of the best decisions that Riot ever made when it came to the longevity of their game and the health of the professional scene. But we have to start with where League of Legends was in 2009 when the game was released. So at the time, when the game was in beta and right after release, the common metagame was for one player to select a hero, call solo mid, meaning that they're going alone into the mid lane, and they would get more experience because they weren't having to share XP in the lane than most of the other players on the map. So therefore, usually the solo mid was the best player or the carry player on that team, whereas the other 2 players, or other 4 players rather, split into pairs and went off into the top and bottom lane. So fast forward a couple of years to 2011, and most prominently at the Season 1 World Championship for League of Legends, by this time the professional teams and the professional players had really started to develop a strategy of having junglers and supports in the game. And the presence of junglers came about because some of the pro players realized that with a certain combination of runes and masteries, some champions with high sustain like Warwick and Nunu could safely clear the jungle, and therefore it would allow one more player to be in lane alone to really soak up the maximum amount of gold and experience, and the jungle player could path through, consistently take those resources as they respawned in the jungle, and therefore you were really maximizing the amount of XP and gold that the team as a whole could take across the entire map. Now, simultaneously to this, some pro players started to understand that ranged attack damage carries scaled much better with items than they did with levels. And so it wasn't really a problem for them to share a lane with another player, but if that player played a hero that did not need a lot of items, but who scaled with levels relatively well, then they could give all of the gold to a champion that would really benefit from having a lot of items and superpower them into a carry status, whereas what became known as the support player would focus primarily on utility and providing consumables like wards for sight on the map, and could still be effective in fights even without a lot of items themselves. Now, this was really revolutionary to the League of Legends meta, and it was not really intended by Riot to develop in this fashion. However, once they realized that this was going on, Riot made decisions in order to basically create jungle items that could be used by junglers. That they created support items where supports could passively gain income or have access to a number of wards or other items to put vision on the map or provide utility in other ways. And this really started to define the League of Legends meta up until what we know today has occurred. And we started to see them work around runes and masteries to provide those for junglers and supports, and then AD carries, the mid lane mages, the top lane tanks, all of the metas that we saw develop. And this was fantastic, not only for the professional scene, but for the casual scene as well, because now we see what you can do in League of Legends is if you just want to play jungle or you just want to play top lane, you can designate that, queue in, play the role that you're comfortable with, play the role that you have the most fun with, and not fight with your teammates over who is going to play what once you get matched into a game via the matchmaking system, because it tries to put you in that role that you want to play first and foremost. So great from a casual angle, but also great from a professional angle, because the creation of dedicated roles makes sure that pro players have a longer career than if they have to flex to roles that they're maybe not so comfortable on, or even play heroes, or in League of Legends case, champions that they are not so comfortable on. So it allows them to focus on a specific skill set so that they can refine that skill set over the years and really make sure they have a longer career, because the meta doesn't shift wildly between what they are expected to do or not do, which then leads to better storylines, better play overall in the game, better engagement from fans as they can follow their favorite players for years and years at a time. So all of this was hugely, hugely beneficial, I think, to League of Legends. And it did take a couple of years for the meta to develop on its own, but once Riot recognized that that meta was there, they stuck to it, they balanced around it, they created items around it, they created runes around it, they created masteries around it, and that meant that I think everybody had a better idea, from the casuals to the pro players, of how the game should be played and a framework within which to play. Now we get to Overwatch, and Overwatch is nearly 3 years old since its release at this point in time, and we've already seen the developers of Overwatch react very nimbly to certain changes and certain metagames that have developed within the Overwatch ecosystem. Primarily, the biggest change I think that they've made is that the game was designed to have no hero limits, meaning that you could play 6 of any one hero, which obviously became a very terrible idea very quickly, but they dialed back on that and then instituted this one hero limit. And I would argue that now that we've seen numerous metas develop across the ladder and at the professional level, that the most fun meta to watch, and I think for most people to also play in game, would be the 2 support, 2 tank, 2 DPS meta. And I think that these roles should be locked in the ladder now, and I think that they should be locked in the professional scene. And I know a lot of people will be concerned about not having as much variation in the game. I actually think there will be more variation because when you have these role locks, it prevents certain compositions from being overpowered, and we'll talk about GOATs in just a second. And it also presents more, I think, clearly defined strengths and weaknesses, which will cause teams to switch compositions more frequently within game to attempt to counter each other, and I think will just enable a much more diverse meta. So when we look at GOATs, which has been the dominant meta in Overwatch professional play for about the last 6+ months now, we have to ask, how did this end up occurring? How did we get this 3 tank, 3 support meta? And how can we prevent something happening again that is so dominant? The answer might be we can't, but I do think that this meta developed because when you have infinite possibilities, if you can play 6 supports on a team or you can play 6 tanks on a team, it becomes very hard to balance those roles for the Overwatch developers. And I would argue that if we locked the roles, it would be much easier to balance. So for example, one of the primary aspects that makes GOATs functional is because you can have these 3 supports, especially when you have Brigitte there. But Brigitte is limited in her healing output because she has to be in range with her mace to trigger her Inspire ability to really provide the healing over time that the GOAT's composition needs to function. But if Brigitte was one of only 2 supports, as in you could only have 2 supports on the team, without the Lucio and the Zenyatta there, so Lucio to get Brigitte in range with speed boost in order to start applying the Inspire, and Zenyatta, who's also going to be providing a lot of healing with the Transcendence and can heal people more effectively and consistently outside of combat when the Inspire is not triggered on Brigitte. Without those 2 with Brigitte, we really wouldn't have seen a GOATs meta develop, because all 3 of these things are necessary in order for GOATs to function. Likewise, with the 3 tanks coming into play when it comes to GOATs, they have so much HP that all of this sustained healing makes them very, very difficult to kill because of their large HP pools. It also makes balancing just very difficult, because you can't turn Brigitte into a support that functions well with only one other support or in a 2-2-2 locked system, because you can't increase her healing enough to justify her weakness of, being at a distance and being disengaged and not being able to heal. But if you had locked the roles, you might be able to, say, buff her healing But there's also still the clear downside of her having to be in range and hitting other enemy heroes in order to activate it. So there's a lot of things you could do that I think would simplify balance if you split these categories up. Now, some of the big challenges for this would be if we did end up with a system where it was a 2-2-2 lock, that we'd have to be very careful about how we split the heroes into support, damage dealing, and tank categories, right? Because there are obviously some sort of hybrid heroes like Brigitte or Roadhog that might fall into one or two different categories. And it would take really massive balance changes in order to balance all heroes across the board if there was a role lock. Like I'm saying, some heroes would be much weaker, like Brigitte, if they had to be in a dedicated support role, and you could only have one other support to accompany them. But also it would make Brigitte more specialized in that she would be a great support to use against a dive composition with heroes like Sombra or Tracer or Genji, but she would be a lot less useful if your opponent's running a sniper composition where she's never going to be able to get in range of these heroes. So it would create, I think, very distinct strengths and weaknesses to certain compositions, which in turn would make, I think, a lot of strategies more interesting. I also think it's harder to have sort of a catch-all composition if you can't mix and match an infinite number of heroes, right? So if you can't mix and match any combination of heroes in the game, in some ways it will, like, objectively, obviously, mathematically, it will more limit the number of combinations of teams that you can have. But I would argue that we'll probably see more compositions if you do this, because I think it would highlight compositional strengths and weaknesses significantly more, rather than being able to default to the most powerful sort of catch-all combination of heroes that are currently available. And it would also solve a lot of the problems that we're seeing with high HP pools and healing over time, because you simply couldn't make goats anymore, and you couldn't make compositions that would thrive off of the same amount of like tankiness and resilience that we see in the goats meta, which I think most people are not wild about watching when it comes to Overwatch. I also think from just a casual perspective, and Stylosa talks with Jeff Kaplan in the interview that I've linked, about what this would mean for the casual fan. And because if you locked at 2-2-2, that means role queue is suddenly an option. Because I can say, hey, I want to play tank, or I want to play DPS, or I want to play support, and I'll just queue up. And I know that's what I'm going to play when I get into a game. And I think this is really important because as it sits currently, if I want to play tank and I get into a game with two other tanks, well then, I have to fight with them for tank, and if I flex onto DPS or I flex onto support, maybe I'm not good at DPS or support. And so then my team starts getting mad at me because I'm bad at that role, and I am not having fun because I know I'm bad, and I'm apologizing to my teammates, or I'm getting angry and flaming them because I'm not playing my role. And it makes sitting down to play a game of Overwatch a lot less ideal than it could be. Because I think, for me personally, Overwatch, when you have a 6-stack, or when you get your role and you have a team that works together well and everybody's happy, it's just a fucking great game. And when you don't have that, when people start flaming each other, it becomes really unpleasant because everybody's having a bad time, and it starts out at the beginning of the game when you can't get the role that you think you're good at. And also, as Jeff Kaplan brings up, this also will allow people to have different matchmaking ratings depending on their class. So instead of having to buy an entirely new account to play off your traditional role, you'll be able to say, hey, well, my DPS MMR is lower, so I can go and practice DPS rather than, say, using your current MMR. So if I'm have a higher MMR on one of my classes currently, I can't really practice at a level on support, right? If I'm a tank player, I can't say, okay, I'm going to be going into this game and try and practice my support, but I'm bad at support, so then my rating drops, it makes my teammates mad, even if I'm trying legitimately to improve at another role. So it allows you to have separate matchmaking ratings for each role, tank, DPS, and support, and I think that would be hugely beneficial because it would mean that people could actually try and improve their other roles without tanking a bunch of games at the MMR of their highest level role, if that makes sense. So I think there's a lot of pros to this. Also, I think it would help unify the game from a casual perspective when people watch the professional scene, whether it's Contenders or the Overwatch League, Overwatch World Cup, or any of the other tournaments we've had in the past. Because while GOATS is very common at the professional scene, most casual Overwatch players are not going to understand it because that's not what their games look like at a silver or gold or platinum level for the most part, because GOATS is a very intricate strategy that is difficult to pull off. And personally, I really enjoy watching GOATS, not all the time, okay? Not all the time. I don't need to watch GOATS as much as I'm watching it right now. But from a strategic standpoint, it's very interesting. However, the level of coordination and execution that it takes to pull off GOATS is really not feasible in a pickup game at a lower rank of play. So by aligning what most people would experience in their queue game, as in locked roles, when I watch, I expect to be able to see the 2-2-2 composition. I think it will increase actual fan engagement with the professional scene because it's easier to learn when the game looks like what you're playing on the ladder. It's easier to say, hey, I can watch this professional match and I can apply this to my own gameplay, whereas GOATS right now and many other professional metas that we've had don't really fall into that category. And I also think it's better for the professional players in the Overwatch League because frankly, it sucks to have a meta where we have all of these hit scan specialists who have been practicing hit scan for years, not only in Overwatch, but in many other games, right? They have honed these skills, some of them for like a decade of playing hit scan characters across many different titles, and we don't get to see that. And not only that, but those players who have these very defined skill sets, you never know if the meta is going to shift in a way right now where we have these guys playing Brigitte, which may not be up to their strength and also creates some really bad instability in the scene and really kills, I think, potentially some players' careers because there's so much uncertainty around whether you can have some really dedicated specialists on your roster, because if the ideal way of playing the game, if the metagame shifts away from that, then there's never really going to be an option to have like a sick Widowmaker player. We've seen very little of that so far in this first stage of the Overwatch League. And taking away from what these players' strengths are and forcing them onto weird picks that don't suit their many thousands of hours of practice is both unsatisfying to me as a viewer and also I think is just objectively bad for player longevity, because you never know when that player is going to have to switch to playing Brigitte and then, you know, they don't play well in Brigitte, so maybe they're dropped by their team or traded, and we lose out on some potentially amazing players. We lose out potentially on careers that could have lasted years. We lose out on all the stories that we could have had about this player having played in the Overwatch League for many years, and they were a sick Widowmaker then, and they're a sick Widowmaker now, or this new hit scan hero comes out, and now they're playing Ashe, and it's just really much more exciting to have players around for the long term. And player longevity is just not a thing that's going to happen if the meta can oscillate so wildly and literally feature no DPS heroes in a specific meta. And this could be a problem in the future too, because let's say we go to a meta that is all DPS heroes, right? Well, then we are now shifting away from great tank players like Fissure that we love to see play the game. So I think that this really would stabilize the professional scene in a lot of ways, help us keep our specialist pro players around. And I think that they really should, that the Overwatch development team should take those notes from what we've seen in League of Legends and how once the metagame developed, they started to balance specifically around that. I think it would make balance outside of the initial balance changes to institute 2-2-2, which I think would be significant and very difficult. But I think in the long run, if you jump that hurdle and really lock roles, then you're going to have a better engagement from the fan base on the esport, better longevity for the esports pros themselves, a more dynamic metagame that is about switching compositions and creating counters and playing around that rather than defaulting to what could be strong, and just I think easier balance in the long run overall, because you know that certain heroes simply cannot be played together. You can't play 3 tanks together. You can't play 3 support heroes together. And I think it would increase Blizzard's ability to create interesting mechanics or to really tune things around some specific compositions. So I hope we see that. I do hope we see that role lock. It would be a lot more fun, I think, to play on the ladder as well for basically everybody. And thank you for listening to another episode here of Monte's Musings.